right, welcome to another edition, another episode of New Wine Table Talks on Facebook Live. Today, I'm stoked to be joined with Dr. Brad Harper, as well as Trudi Sang and Kayla Farlow. Kayla's been on, Trudy's been on, and each one of them has been on different times. And so this is cool. Today, we're going to be discussing generations and leadership with generations. The talk of generations is filtered through the church across the span of history. We're an aged people, we talk about the saints and those that have gone before us. And the question is the church a mosaic of ages? We have diversity within ages, or are we an age of monopolized leadership based on how old you are? So does the church promote diversity within the ages, both within volunteering as well as leadership? And so in order for the church to speak into culture, she must understand culture. And so a lot of people, if you've ever heard of theological talk or talk about faith, you might have heard it said that in our quest to know God, we're embarking upon faith-seeking understanding. So what of our understanding of the generations? Does the church understand the truth of our generational beauty, or is this beauty masked, which in today's culture has a deeper meaning now that we're going into the COVID-19 season, this age of COVID-19, where they're not to mask or not to mask. And so has the church masked the beauty of its generational portrait? So Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr. once said that we need leaders not in love with money, but in love with justice, not in love with publicity, but in love with humanity. Leaders who can subject their particular egos to the pressing urgencies of the great cause of freedom. A time like this demands great leaders. And Henry Nouwen, speaker, speaks in his book, I think it's Christian Leadership or Lead Like Jesus. He says that we need leaders who have the heart of Jesus, and speaks about leadership leading as Jesus. And so is this the truth of the church leadership? How does the generational gap get bridged, or does it need to be bridged? And so today, speaking from, I guess, all spectrums, professor in the university, church pastor, father of, generations, as well as then a teacher within the church, Dr. Brad Harper comes to us, and he's a professor of Bible and theology. He's the director of the Masters of Arts in Theological Studies. So we've got undergrad, then we've got graduate work. And then he serves as the assistant dean of the School of Biblical and Theological Studies. So then he's also overseeing those who are training up leaders. And in his past, he has the role of pastor. And he also is the father of three. And so we're excited to have Dr. Harper speaking into this. And so the first question I have, Brad, is in our faith-seeking understanding, is it an understanding that understands the generational gap that's created through whether it's seniors trying to teach those that are just the generation below them, or is it the gap between seniors in high school and seniors in the senior home? There's this generational gap. And so what is the church doing to that? So as a professor in the university, a theologian, and a pastor, how is it that the church does or needs to speak into the needs and concerns of today's university students or graduate students?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. It's a complicated reality, and when we think about the gap, the differences in generations, the the width of that gap is actually something that's fairly recent in human history. In fact, so I'm 62 years old. I'm a baby boomer. So it was in my generation in the 1960s that the term generation gap was coined. This idea that young people, high schoolers, college people are so different than their parents. And the reality is Americans didn't really talk about that before then because it wasn't as wide a gap. And the thing is, if you go back a little bit farther in history, the gap was much, much narrower. The modern culture, the modern world has made the gap wider because the modern world, the contemporary world changes so fast. Whereas you go back to people living in the pre-modern time, culture change was slow or non-existent. I mean, in the Middle Ages, if your dad was a farmer, you just became a farmer. If he was a mason, you became a mason. There wasn't this sense of, I'm going to be something really different than my parents were. The same was true of class, right? So you just didn't have this kind of vast difference between um, young people and their parents. Now, in the ancient world, they were aware of the difference. I mean, there's a lot of writing in the ancient world about how sibling bonds were even tighter than parent-child bonds. So they were aware of this, but the gap, the distance just wasn't the same as it is today. And technology is now changing that so incredibly fast so that each generation is really different than their parents. They are seeing the world really differently than their parents. So when you think about, what do we need to do? What does the church need to do? I mean, the first thing we need to do in terms of looking at the next generation is just simply to realize how much different they are than us, how much differently they see the world, and also to say that's okay. It's okay that they see the world differently. My generation's way of seeing the world is not the standard. It's not some kind of universal standard that, oh, this is the right way to see the world. And now you guys are coming along and seeing it really differently. That's incredibly parochial. So much of how baby boomer American evangelicals, my generation, saw and have seen the world is incredibly shaped by culture and American culture. I remember when I was in my 20s, I went to Le Brie, this place, study place in Switzerland. And I remember the first day I was there, there's a bunch of us Americans there. And so the head of my chalet, who's a European guy, he's a German guy, um, he gets us all together and he's talking to us about all this stuff. And he says, I need to say to you, American evangelicals, one of the things about being in Europe and being Christian is we have a very different view of alcohol than you guys do. Okay, so this was in the 1980s. He said, you American evangelicals, you have this idea that, Christians should never drink, they shouldn't use alcohol. We don't see it that way in Europe. My kids drink wine at dinner. My 8-year-old drinks wine at dinner. This is how we raise our kids. We have a totally different way of dealing with things. And yet, of course, American evangelicals of my generation were like, no, you don't drink, this. And then we foisted that upon our kids, and they're like, are you serious? Are you kidding? With the internet where they see the whole world, all the time. So I think we need to look at their differences, understand that they're different, that that's okay. And sometimes we need to be asking, where are they seeing the world better and more like Jesus than we are? How are they really getting it in ways that we don't? So I need to begin by listening instead of speaking. You ask, how are we speaking to the next generation? I need to be listening to the next generation first before I speak. And then I need to be, open and asking, where are they getting it? And my cultural shaping as a Christian in America has made it so that I don't really get it, and they're opening up my eyes. So those are some of the things I think we need to do.
What do you think has led? I mean, why do you think it is that within your generation the categorization started happening?
You mean the distance?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, the distance again was because I grew up during a world that was accelerating rapidly in terms of change. So listen, my grandfather was a blacksmith, okay? And he shoed horses during the First World War because horses were jeeps. That's what he was doing during the First World War. He's taking care of the horses. My father was an Air Force pilot and then became an aerospace engineer, designed rockets to spy on the Russians, all of that type of stuff, the Hubble telescope. And then there's me. I remember in 1969 sitting in front of our TV with my grandfather and my dad, the aerospace engineer, and me watching Neil Armstrong step onto the moon. And my grandfather is like, this can't be happening. He was a blacksmith. He didn't travel more than 20 miles from home, and everything was done by hand. And here's this guy stepping out on the moon. That's the 20th century. That's the century I grew up in. And so the rapid increase of change and development was something that was really part of the 20th century. And now that we're in the 21st, that's leaving the 20th century behind, even in terms of speed of change. We change a generation with every new iPhone, right? And Yeah, so I think that's what it was. And then my generation in the 60s really started to realize that. So you had, this whole culture shift, in the 1960s with Berkeley and the free speech movement and all this type of stuff, where young people were saying, I'm not like my parents. I want to be different from them.
Yeah.
That never happened to that same extent.
And technology definitely plays into it, right? I mean, technology, it does have the advances such as this. We are able to use Zoom. I mean, and people are going to watch this as recorded. We try to do live. We saw technology. We issues just with this recording here and trying to go live. And so, yes, there are issues with that in the advancement. I think it's one of Heidegger or Jung, one of them talks about acceleration and this idea that we try to accelerate. So, in some sense, technology accelerates maybe even our growth. So, whereas, we talk about this, what we experienced, maybe what your generation experienced with the sexual revolution, it was high school or college. My generation then maybe experienced at college and high school, or high school and junior high, whereas Kayla's generation then was getting into it in elementary and junior high. So things accelerate for sure. So with that in mind then, and you talk about, you mentioned listening. How is it that, because you are hand in hand with New Wine and what New Wine's doing, working with Dr. Metzger, how is it that you guys have come about using New Wine, seeing what New Wine's doing for that leadership? So you have leadership, I mean, for raising up generational leaders and things, but when you're seeking to engage students, there needs to be something more than simply listening. So, what is it that with the relational foundation that allows for then you to, you and Metzger and professors at your school that are able to pour into these students? So, you have listening, but what other aspects of a relational foundation allow for then this gap to be bridged?
Yeah, well, for teaching theology, doing theology in my generation, the way I was taught theology and the way I was taught to teach theology was highly modernistic, rationalist. It was essentially about, okay, I'm the teacher, you're the student. I'm the one who knows everything. I'm going to give you this information, you learn it, and then give it back to me, right?
Mm,
And it's about information transfer. Um, and as you understand, there's a whole lot of problematic things about that. Theology then, in essence, becomes about winning. It's who has the best idea, who can defend their ideas the best. When we did apologetics in the 1970s, 60s, and 70s, apologetics in Christian theology was about learning the other people's worldviews so that you can crush them with Jesus.
mm,
It was about we're right, you're wrong, you need to listen to us. It didn't work back then, and it has even less of a chance of working, in this very diverse, pluralistic world. I don't know. When I think about doing theology, Matt, I think of a couple things that are very different. I think about the incarnation. You know, when God wants to get across his message, Hebrews says, you want to see what I'm like? Look at Jesus. You want to see truth? Look at Jesus, right? Says John. And and so God expresses himself by entering into our world, by becoming one of us. And he doesn't enter into our world, you know, um, just virtually. I mean, he does it. And he enters into our world in a place that's deeply problematic, filled with pain and suffering, and he takes all that stuff on himself, and he listens to the pain that people are feeling. And that's how God does theology. I think of God doing theology, I think of the tripartite promise of the Old Testament. I will be their God, they will be my people, and I will dwell in their midst.
mm,
God doing theology it's about relationship. It's about engagement. It's about, I want to be with you. So theology is something that has to be lived. It can't be something that is just about ideas, and sits in this esoteric place of philosophical ideas. It has to live. And so we take a relational approach to doing theology because a relational approach to theology says, I care about you when we're talking about doing theology. I care about you when we're talking about these ideas. And it's especially important when we do that with people who disagree with us. Right?
yeah, yeah.
We've been talking with Buddhists in community for years, you know, And that didn't really get very far for a while because they had to trust us first, you know. And for us, it had to be okay. First of all, we care about you guys. We want to get to know you. Once that happens, then we'll start talking about theology a little bit, you know. And so we just feel like that's not a new way of doing theology. That's how God does theology. And it's because life is about relationships. God is the triune God, God who exists forever in loving relationship, Father and Son and Spirit. So theology needs to be that way as well.
Yeah. And have you found, if I don't know if you've done this, but looking at the way in which you pastored the church, and then how you teach in the classroom, are there similarities there?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there are. I mean, um, for in the church, so here I was in the church, this PhD student, and then later this guy with this PhD in historical theology, and um, people would kind of be like, "What are you going to do with that in the church? We can do this PhD in theology in the church." I said, "I'm going to teach people theology. I'm going to teach people historical theology." But the deal was, we looked at historical theology through the lenses of people in their lives, right? And we looked at the different periods of history and the problems they were facing and the suffering they were going through. And we did theology through the lens of the lives of people. And when people heard it taught that way in the church, they were like, oh, this is good. This connects to me. This actually makes sense. And in the academy, I'm doing the opposite direction, because the academy expects all that esoteric philosophical, knowledge type stuff. And in the academy, I got to be going, whoa, 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 whoa. None of that really matters unless it engages the suffering of your life. So in the academy, I have to move it from the esoteric and the philosophical and the rational into life. In the church, I have to help them, because they're just thinking about, how's this going to change my life? I have to help them understand how clear and good ideas based in the triune God and his word actually apply to life.
Yeah. And in talking about application in life and taking that incarnational approach, Trudy, you stepped into you're working on a doctorate program right now. And so some would go, oh gosh, like when you go for a doctorate, there's this certain process. You go from undergrad to your master's and then right into the PhD, or maybe a couple of years. Okay. And some of us, though, don't go that course, right? So in going through even your degree and your doctorate, what have you found as far as some of the generational gaps just in the process of you going for your doctorate right now?
Well, thanks for having me join you, Matt. It's been a journey. I mean, and I like Brad. I mean, I'm a baby boomer, and it's kind of like people go, "You're still going to school? Seriously? Don't you stop?" And okay, so I'm sort of a lover of learning, and so for me, it was really I love to learn, and and it's I'm weird that way, and that did not come from my family. That was not something passed on, so I was kind of an oddity even within my family. But it was always going to school was a place to really structure thinking and exploring, and I think that's the doctorate is more than just a title or this hoop you're jumping through. Going through the cohort and being with people life on life and relationship, and just really challenging each other and encouraging each other to grow deeper, ask hard questions and press into those questions. The To live in that world of challenge and question, it really is just so delightful to me. It's so refreshing, and to really look at, okay, at how can this relate to where I'm at too. So it's not this thing on a shelf that's going to look good. It's how's it really living out into the ministries that we're in. And that's what's so delightful about our cohort, is that we're living it out in different ways, in different venues, and applying it with real practical application. It's not just a bunch of knowledge. I mean, I love to learn, but it's also been great to be challenged and explored. And so, okay, how is this going to work? And it's been interesting. I was, I was on a call that I facilitate earlier today on, it's a special needs network of people that are in ministry in our area here in the Portland area. And we were talking about the impacts of COVID, and it was kind of relating to that it's pressing us into having to do things differently, that we don't always do things the same as it always has been. So like even within the church, we're not doing things just because we have to do it that way. We have to think of how can we still hold on to that relationship and make it significant and make it meaningful and supportive in the midst of all of the different restrictions and situations that we're in. In the special needs ministry, it's incredibly complex because you're dealing with a vulnerable population on top of that. So you're dealing with layers of complexity. But within the church, it's been exciting to work with some of our younger folk as well as the older, because everyone wants to bring something to the table. So if it means from a safe distance, you're able to run around and give little bags and hang it on people's doors and saying, here's updates from the church, or here's some, fun, encouraging things at a spatial thing, as well as youth doing similar things. And I think in the church, I think as Brad was bringing up, there was that generation gap. And then it was almost pressured that if you're a certain age, you can't relate to anybody younger, that's out the door now. You can't talk to these people. And that just didn't make sense to me. And then as I worked with at-risk youth in the earlier years, and then in the Portland schools, and then I moved into youth ministry, I loved being able to be that. And it was funny because a few years ago, I was mentoring some young women, and fun, we're even reading some New Wine books. It's so cool. And I said, do you still want to meet with me now that you've graduated from high school? They go, oh yeah, yes, please. We love chatting. And honestly, it's like when we sit down with dialogues, we sit down with a cup of tea and we just talk and we form relationship. It's that life on life, that sharing. And some of them have taken it to their college settings, and they're doing tea time with, people discussing the Bible. And I think it doesn't have to be this massive, complex design. And I think that's where they have said, no, we want to hear from you. We want to hear your voice. And it's not like I'm pressuring them to be like me, but they can filter it and use what resonates with them, or how they can move forward, or just to be able to encourage them to move forward, and that I can cheer them on, and when they take off, I can just cheer again. It's exciting.
So this is for you and for Brad. Would you both? How would you decipher relationships between you and your parents, and then you and your kids? Is it moving closer, where from your parents to you there was a closeness, but then from you to your kids you're moving closer into that relationality? So is hoping that your kids then and their kids, where your grandkids then, if there are grandkids in the picture, that there's more deeper relationships, so that the baby boomer generation has had to learn how to relate to their kids differently because of what they were taught from their parents? Or how do you see that being passed down generationally in your guys' lives, between you and your parents and then you and your kids?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I see as a change that transitioned in my generation was that in the 20th century, much of the 20th century, the roles of moms and dads were pretty distinctly defined in terms of what you do. and the jobs that you do around the house and those types of things. And I saw that with my parents. It was now my mom worked outside the house, but that was just on top of all the normal wife stuff she was supposed to do. And moms are supposed to do this with the kids, and then dads do that with the kids, and that type of thing. And there's so many problems with that. I mean, first of all, there's just a bunch of gender stereotypes that go into that are deeply lots of people. But also, what it does is it compartmentalizes people in their roles in the family. Um, and I don't know why I decided this, but in my life, I just decided it was going to be really different, and that I wasn't going to think about roles, classic roles for husbands and wives, and how and Robin and I just were involved in our kids' lives in all the same ways. You know, it wasn't okay, you do these things, I'll do these things. No, we were involved in all of it, and we were both involved in cooking and cleaning and, you know, changing our kids' diapers and all of that type of stuff. And some of that was created by the fact that it's in my generation that families really began to become two-income families. And so mom couldn't do everything that she was supposed to do. Dad had to help, you know, instead of just sitting on the couch and watching TV after work, right? And I think that's really created some positive things in terms of just moms and dads entering into their kids' lives more holistically because they're not compartmentalized, you know, in terms of, okay, this is the dad's job, this is the mom's job.
Well, my background is a little different in that I was adopted by my great aunt and uncle. So we're talking about a generation even more removed. My dad had a third grade education, my adopted dad, and my adopted mom had an eighth grade graduation or education. So I grew up in a very different kind of setting and very, very, very traditional in the way that they functioned. In all areas. And then I went to go to school and kept going to college. And it was, I really broke out of that traditional role. And, you know, when my husband and I got married, and he's Chinese, he became a citizen after we got married, actually. And even though his family was from the old country, in many ways, the two of us have really created that teamwork kind of network. So it's like we both love to cook. We team up, and we've explored that and modeled that to our kids. And we have one biological child who's got special needs and two adopted daughters that are half sisters. And then we had a permanent foster child for 11 years. So we tried to show them and share with them, and we still love to just sit down and talk with them. So dialogue and conversation, you know, is really critical for what we've tried to explore with them, and to help them to have good conversation and support as well.
Yeah, and the gap in generations is interesting. Kayla, you have the opportunity to interact with your grandparents as well as your parents, you know, and your cousins, aunts and uncles all in the same day, because we all live in a very close, probably too close of a proximity. Um, uh, but we get to step into each other's lives. So from, you know, you're a senior in college. You are a psychology major, so you are an expert in analyzing people. Um, so from your standpoint, 21 years old, what are some of the things in which you've seen from, you know, generational leadership that have played into how you then are being trained up or want to be a leader in the church? Because you've been a leader at different levels at your school as well as in the church, you know, leading worship, leading Bible studies, leading community groups on campus. Where is it that you see your leadership being gained from, and how is it that you want to be a leader for the next generations below you? Because you stepped into the lives of girls and boys, you know, that are younger than you. So what kind of leadership style are you seeking to you know, mimic?
Okay. Well, I think, I mean, a lot of it has to do with how you guys raised me. Obviously, that plays into kids' lives in a large way. And I see the differences in parenting styles with how our cousins interact and lead too, which is kind of cool. But parents definitely play a role. And I mean, like Brad and Trudy were saying, watching your parents and like how they interact with each other definitely influences you. So I think, watching you and mom live and be best friends and centered around Jesus, it totally affects the way you live out your life, and the way you lead others. So, I mean, what style do I want to lead with? I want to lead with the style of Jesus. Um, Zero discrimination. He didn't care what status someone was. He didn't care what age someone was. He wanted to love and lead. And so I want to do that. I've been able to interact with our cousins as they grow up, and I'm the oldest of all the grandchildren. So I kind of was placed in the role of like babysitter leader within family, but then I'm also the oldest sibling, so I don't know. I kind of just end up taking lead in any group that I'm placed in. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, but that just kind of happens. Um, and I'm okay with that. I'm okay with being the spokesperson, but being the spokesperson for the group means that you have to learn how to listen. And I've been the new kid in schools too, and so that experience of like being brushed over, whether intentionally or not, um, makes you sit back and you have to like observe the situation, observe people. And so I just want to see people. I want to, make sure they feel seen and know that, hey, I care, right? Like I'm here and I want to listen to you, and I want to, not just listen to you, but like dialogue with you. And yeah, I care about your life. I see you, and I want you here. You matter. So that's kind of what I've tried to do as I've grown up. Different leadership positions in the church, and in school. I mean, I remember I think I was like 12 or 13, and I tried out for the worship team, the main worship team, for the main service at our church. And I was told that I was too young. And that was the only thing that prohibited me from being on the team, was my age. And that, I think, was like the first real time where I was like, but I want to worship Jesus. Like, what, like, why does it matter how young I am? And so, like, whether it's how young you are or how old you are, I don't want people to experience that, especially within the church, because we all have something to offer, and we're all gifted with, talents. And I think that if we are able to recognize that and say, like, hey, these are my strengths and I would love to use them, we should be given a place to use them, So I don't know
Yeah.
if that answered the question very well.
No, that does, right? Because being told that you can't do something based on some type of, a trait or characteristic of us based that someone else determines is how they're going to judge you, right?
Yeah,
Age,
absolutely.
color of skin, level of education,
Yeah.
in this is for all three of you, in today's political culture, age is a big thing. We have
Mm-hmm.
the two oldest candidates right now on
Yeah.
the Republican and the Democrat side. And the Democrat side just chose their VP, and one of the big things is to be able to show a broad a lessening of that age gap, and so they made a big deal that the VP selection is she's I think 22 years younger than Biden, and yet that still puts her above 50. There were other candidates that were in their 40s, and so how does that play out though in the church? Brad, you've been a part of the church, both going, and same thing with you, Trudi, because you've pastored, you care pastor, also director of the special needs for your church. And then also, Trudy, you were just named the co-president of the Interfaith Disabilities Network of Oregon. So you're going to be working across generations. So Brad, in your dealings with the church as well as with the academy, when is it that leadership is handed off to whatever we call the younger generation? You mentioned a modern mindset. So what is the younger generation today? You also mentioned, I think, in one of our discussions, maybe it was the previous table talks, about millennials not having a problem if they're at church tithing, much more willing to tithe online. You know, they don't need to. So what is the gap when it says, you know, the next generation, in your estimate, what is the next generation that we're pouring into? Because isn't discipleship part of a generational filling of that gap?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple things that we need to think about in leadership, whether it's in the church or outside the church, but certainly in the church. One of the things we have to do right at the beginning is decide that diversity is a good thing, that diversity matters. And by
Mm,
that, I mean having different people, whatever differences you want to talk about, gender, age, socioeconomic status, education, that having those people together in partnership, in community, leading is better than having just one kind of person. Because a group of one kind of people, whether it's age or color or gender or whatever, is just flat gonna miss a bunch of stuff, right? You only catch that stuff and see it when you have a diverse community of leaders. So we need to decide ahead of time that diversity is good, and that diversity isn't just about we need to have tokens,
mm,
but we really need to listen to these people. Young people have something to teach us. Baby boomers need to understand. I need to listen to young people because I can learn from them. They can expose some of my blind spots. I need them, right? Um, and let's just be honest, Matt. Too, part of it is always just being willing to give up power,
mm,
willing to share power, because sharing power is difficult. I don't care who you are. Everybody likes to hold on to power, right? And so giving it off and pressing it off to the next generation is something that's hard. Baby boomer pastors right now should be passing the baton off to the next generation. Quit holding on to it. But there's an interesting thing that's gone on in the life of the American evangelical church, too, in the latter half of the 20th century that is so counterproductive to all of this, especially in terms of age, and that is the way we started to structure the church. So starting, in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, we started separating everybody.
mm.
Nursery, elementary school, junior high school youth, college group, unmarried singles, young marrieds, young people, young families with new kids. And it's like you went up and once you had a baby, you had to leave that group because you're not part of them anymore. Because now you've got a kid, and then you got the seniors, and you got a pastor for each group. And the thing is, when are those people ever together? Well, they're not. They go to their own little tribal thing. And so the church is exacerbating and facilitating tribalism through its own structures. And it needs to reevaluate those structures. And part of it is going to be people saying, I need to be willing to be uncomfortable because everybody likes to be with the people that are just like them.
Mm.
Philip Yancey said years ago in Christianity Today editorial, he said, he went to church in Chicago, and he said, I don't go to a mega church. He said, the reason I don't is because at a mega church, you can have whatever you want. You can go to be with your people, your tribe, whatever. He said, because if I were at a mega church, I would hang out with people with master's degrees who drink Starbucks coffee and drive ecologically friendly cars. And this was 30 years ago, so Starbucks was a big thing back then. He says, instead, I go to a church in the inner city where on one side of me is a millionaire and the other side of me is a homeless person. And I'm not comfortable with either one of them. But I know I need to be with them in order for me to learn to follow Jesus. And I think the people that Jesus involved in his lives, let the children come to me. He chooses Simon the Zealot, and then Matthew the tax collector. I mean, who could be more opposite? So for Jesus, diversity was good. And unity meant not being all like each other, but taking diverse people and figuring out how they can come together under Jesus Christ to love God and neighbor.
Mm.
Right?
Yeah, yeah. The categorization is so interesting that the church falls right into it. You know, without even thinking about it. When we were at a church when we were doing the masters at Multnomah, and the church we were going to, at first our kids always sat in with us. You know, they would sing with us, they would listen, and then they would, Kayla being 5 or 6 would ask questions. Well, while the guy or the female, they're preaching and made people nervous. They're like, oh my gosh, first of all, and I always laugh because it's not a movie theater, you know. Yes, she had little girl whisper is, a little bit louder than some people are used to. And then my son would eat in the, I mean, we were meeting in a gym, but he would eat there and people thought that was crazy. Like, oh my gosh, what are you, or he would play with his, cars, but we wanted to do it together. And like you were saying, it was baffling to me that the church didn't even see how it was segregating itself. And then wondering, why is it that we have such a segregated set of Christians? And so Trudi, you of all people then being a care pastor, but then also how you said the makeup of your family, adoptions, special needs, intercultural. So how is it that you've navigated those different realms, but then also being in the church, how has it helped you to then allow to be open to all the intricacies of relational truth within the church as a leader?
I think the one rich thing that James's culture brings to the table from a Chinese culture is the respect of elders and the importance of the elders. And I think that's sometimes lost in translation, especially from the baby boomers on, was not always embraced as often. And that's sort of sad, because then you see these incredibly gifted people sitting in your church, which could just bring such wealth of just wisdom, or just encouragement, or teaching, or just friendship. And they're saying, oh, well, we're retired, and they just kind of get checked off into this little category over here. And where we see richness is when those individuals are able to step into the lives of, the new moms, or the teens, or others that are coming alongside that just need that spiritual family. And I think that we've lost the translation of spiritual family to include multi-generational perspectives. And I'm just delighted when those things actually come through, and you see seniors go, wow, we've started we did a food pantry here to kind of fill in the gap until other food pantries came up. And it was so cool to see some of our senior population step in and, do the grocery shopping through the rows, be significant contributors. And then the teens are coming alongside, helping lift all the stuff, and having that collaboration, which is family. And I think that that's something I think in some ways COVID has pushed that a little more, so that we're not so segregated. And then I was kind of humorously thinking about where our staff is right now with our church. And it's like, I think there's a representative from almost every decade, starting at age the 22 on up. And so there's one from each decade, and we're having a blast. And I'm going, okay, we're all from different perspectives. We're all from different generations. And the oldest is 81. and he's phenomenal. He's just a kick in the pants. And we have so much fun just bridging these perspectives, and it brings richness to the conversation. And I think I'm excited when we're in our conversations, and I would hope that could be prevailing and not so isolating.
Yeah.
I had an interesting experience when I was a pastor back in the late 80s and early 90s. We started this group. There was this show on TV that was really popular back then called 30 something. But this was a group of 20s, singles in their 20s. So we called it 20 something, right? This thing grew really fast. We had a couple hundred of these 20 something, singles. We were looking in a lot of them in the corporate world in St. Louis. And this thing grew. And after about 4 years, my leaders came to me and said, oh, because we were meeting off campus,
Mm.
right? So we're doing our own thing off campus, lots of non-Christians coming. It was a really cool thing going on. My leaders came to me and said, we don't want to do this anymore. I said, what are you talking about? It's great. It's going really well. They're going, because we miss being connected to old people and children. We don't go to the main church campus. We go here and we're just with our 20-year-olds. We need to be connected to different kinds of people. So we moved back to the church and we started this deal in the church called Take a Single to Lunch Day,
Oh.
where I invited families to invite a single person, often who were living not in their hometown, so they had no family around, somebody in their 20s, over to lunch once a month on Sundays, right? After church. And it was phenomenal. So here you had, one or two single people going over to someone's house where the parents are way older than they are, and there's little kids around. Sometimes the people inviting them over there are in their 70s, 80s, whatever. And you've got these 20-year-olds, 20 to 30-year-olds who are now spending time with and being discipled and loved by children and
Mm.
people their parents' age and people their grandparents' age. It was one of the most successful things we ever did. And they just went, yeah, this is what it's supposed to be. It's
Yeah,
powerful.
I'm. It's interesting again. The just doesn't understand this. Some of the greatest times that my wife and I had with her grandparents, both of them just passed away, within this last year, was going to their house, just the two of us, and sitting down with them because they were old school. They still had happy hour, and it was cool. And I thought it was the greatest thing. I mean, I wasn't her grandfather was a Scotch guy, and I just was, oh, but I would just sit with him because what he lived through, with the depression and with the wars, and he was he was brought up in the apprenticeship at the Livermore Labs and was a leading scientist, but never had the technical how we have the PhDs and stuff. He was raised in this system, after he came back from the war. But to listen to him, and it was always, and I tell my kids all the time, yes, their grandparents, they're baby boomers, and sometimes the way they see the world is a little bit different. But the wisdom that they have, if you're just willing to sit. And so, Kayla, this is for you. What are some of the things, though, that you see as your generation, especially when you're hanging out with the university students, that they just are, your generation doesn't understand what some of the generations above you actually have to offer your generation? Because the one thing we don't want is so much focus on the 30 and 20-year-olds that we do, like you were saying, Trudy, we completely neglect anyone that's 65 and older,
Yeah.
or 70 or 80. So what is it that you've seen, Kayla, that the church needs to avoid or can do, or even at the academy, the university, to where your generation appreciates those that have gone before you?
Well, I mean, I think one of the, just in general, one of the cool things about Scotland was the respect for elders, especially in the church. And we would have like, I think it was once a month, we would have a big meal at the church hall. And the women, the elderly women in the church would always like make such great soup. And that was like their favorite. Like, they're like, no, no, we don't need help. Like, we're doing this for you. It was just awesome because we sat at a like big long table and served each other, and it was a big family like meal as a church. And so I like that stuff. So the dinners with singles made me think of that. Um, and I think we need to, as a church, kind of get back to that, like potlucks and dinners at each other's houses, and because the church is a family. And I think we just so often, I mean, obviously it's because of COVID, everything is different and harder. Um, but even before the pandemic, people would just go to church and leave. And there wasn't, I don't know, growing up, maybe it's because I was on staff, but we would just sit and talk for hours after the service and fellowship with people. And that's just what church was. And I feel like we've kind of gotten away from that, even whether church or, academically. people would sit and talk before and after things, and we just don't do that as much. I think my generation is kind of go, go, go. You know, we have tasks and to-do lists and checklists, and we just have to keep moving. And I think that that's something to be wary of, because, you know, so often we just need to be in the moment. We need to learn how to be and just appreciate everyone and everything around us. And, you know, that's what living is, instead of just doing, you know. So I think that's something, but also getting back to the respect for our elders. I mean, they have so much to offer us. And I think that goes for, you know, across the board, is just to listen, right? But that means you have to sit down and interact with one another in order to listen. And you have to give each other the time of day. I think so often, like, offered to university students are like, oh, here's, you know, people you can babysit for, or daycares you can volunteer, and why don't we go into nursing homes? You know, why don't we serve there? So I think just, I don't know, opportunities on both spectrums to serve, you know. We're able-bodied humans. We can go pick up groceries and do heavy lifting for, you know,
Yeah.
little kids and older.
And learning how to accept help, right? Isn't that some of the issues
Yeah.
that, you know, and you being old enough and able to step in and help out your grandparents, they are, you know, in their 60s and they're still very able bodies, but it's hard to receive help from their grandchildren, whether it's moving a chair or, I mean, how many times is, you know, your pops fallen off a ladder because he has to do it on his own, you know, and he's not too old to do that, right? And so just as much as you have to learn how to want to listen to them, right? They have to learn how to accept help, you know, receiving.
Yeah.
And like Brad, you were talking, it's sometimes an issue of power, right? If and I'm not sure if this is a baby boomer generation or if it's before that, but to receive help is seen as a weakness for some reason. And we're seeing it play out to a little bit with the political spectrum as to which person is the least weak, you know, and wearing a mask is a sign of weakness, you know, and these kind of things. And so I'm not sure if that's from the baby boomer generation or even that you guys learned from your parents. But when it comes to the leadership of Jesus, he was always about not being a power monger, not trying to lord over people. So moving forward in this idea, you talked about diversity of age, diversity of look, diversity of economics, and things like that. Brad, what is the best way forward though for the church, and who can it look to, or does it have it within itself in its own theology, so as to not create further generational gaps in the midst of COVID-19? How can it use this time period to bridge gaps generationally?
Yeah, well, certainly what COVID is doing is completely uh, reconfiguring the way we do kids, right? And I'm not necessarily saying it's reconfiguring it in a good way, in a way that we would want to keep up long term. There's some certain things about how we're doing church right now that I don't want to keep up, because I miss face-to-face contact, you know, that kind of thing. But whenever you get upended like this, one of the best things you can do is stop as a community and go back and say, okay, what are we actually about? What is the church really about? Who are we? What defines us? And what are we supposed to be doing? And American Americans in general, and American evangelicals in terms of how they create and structure church, are super pragmatic. We structure things based on what works. So like back in the 1980s and 90s, like, you know, so many churches in America looked at Willow Creek Community Church and let the mega church growing to 25,000 people and seeing all the different things that they were like, oh, let's do that. And so they just clone, you know, this church and do all the things they did. Most of those churches actually failed, because what they were doing is they were just looking at let's do these things that gets a lot of people in the door. But they weren't asking the question, what are we really about? What are we supposed to be doing here? What defines us? Whether or not it's effective. In an American sense of effective, which means it brings in people and money. What are we about? Jesus didn't leave the world with a lot of followers or a lot of money. And so I think this is a time for us to step back and go, what are we about? And we need to be thinking about the triune God and about community and what it means to build community, and be saying as we go forward, all right, what are some structures that we've had in the past that we can let go of because we realize they're actually anti-communal and more tribal? And what are some new ways we can do things that actually create and depend upon more diversity and move us in new directions? And so it's a good time to do it.
Yeah, and I don't know if you got pushback, but I would imagine that when you guys were pushing forward with New Wine, you and Paul, reliance on students was probably, and the allowance for students to speak so much into these issues was probably thought to be a bit, crazy. I mean, to allow student leaders, and 20 years ago, even 20 years ago, we're talking the early 2000s, like that still was a new thing.
Yeah.
And so, you said you and your wife wanted to do it differently. Was that from the church that you learned that you want to do things differently, or was it just a progression of you looking at everything around you?
I think for us, it was just looking at ourselves and looking around us and saying, what does it mean to be a family? What does it mean to build relationships? And what does it mean to welcome people into our home that our kids bring into our home that are very, very different than we are? And that just became something that we really began to value. And so I think we saw it a lot that way in our family. And for me, I just began to really ask those questions about the church too. A big part of it too, Matt, that really affected me was 25 years ago in St. Louis. I was part of an organization called Reconcilers that I helped to start. And it was about Black and white Christian leaders coming together to find ways to build relationships through Jesus. St. Louis is a very, very Black and white city. And for me, it was going into that naively, and this is probably a 35-year-old guy, thinking I actually had something to offer, finding out very, very quickly that I didn't have much to offer, but I had a lot to learn. And what I learned from my Black pastor friends, what those guys taught me, could only have happened from me spending time with people who were way different than me and whose life experience was really different than mine, challenged a lot of my experiences. That's when I began to learn. And I think that then just became part of how I thought about church, academics, all like that.
Yeah. And so moving forward, Trudy, what is it that you try to pour into your kids, your own kids, as well as then friends your age in the church, to develop, establish, maintain generational, unity?
I think that for our kids, for one, I mean, obviously it's a little different because we have our older son who is special needs who lives at home. And then we have a 26-year-old that lives at home. And, there's a lot of pressure from society. I mean, it's not like we don't have the space, and it's not like she's not contributing because she's helped doing caregiving for my son who's pretty nonverbal. But there's such a societal kind of stigma that gets put upon that says, well, you're not all launched out on your own. And our other daughter is married and has a stepdaughter, and they live, but they even lived with us for a period of time. Now, in the Chinese culture, having multi-generations in the same household is not uncommon. In fact, when we first got married, we were living with his folks, and then we got a home and moved away, and they were really disappointed. It was kind of, no, we wanted you to stay. And it was kind of, it was hard. And now, you know, we're seeing that, you know, from a, you know, the way our world is right now, who can afford to live you know, all on their own? For what? For lack of, for this, to say that you are, you know, independent, even though you're suffering financially. And I mean, it's, you know, delicate dance of letting her be an adult and be present in our home. But I think that communicating to them that defining it however it feels good to them is okay. And I feel like sometimes our society has put some huge pressures on the younger generation, and stigmas that are just ridiculous. And yet, yeah, I know that everybody has to meet their own needs as to where their comfort level is and how well the communication goes. But I think that just not pigeonholing people. And I think where we live, it's very kind of a suburbia area, which is just in a lot of ways so toxic, in the fact that people drive into their driveways, close the doors, and you don't see people, right? They disappears into these caves of, yes, we're independent, successful individuals that live in a home with a car and a garage, and yet are isolated and lonely. And then when you break out of that, and like in our cul-de-sac right now, there's a bunch of kids and there's people, I mean, like my neighbor coming home to our house today going, is your internet down? Oh my goodness, we're breaking that wall of communication and coming through the neighborhood. It's so refreshing to be able to have that, you know, to ride over to a neighbor's house and say, hey, we got a big turkey in the middle of August. Do you want some, share some turkey dinner? And, you know, and feel okay about breaking those walls. Because I think so often, and maybe it's really, to me, it's very, I've heard people say that when they move to the Northwest, it's very isolating. And it's the most unfriendly place because everybody's trying to make their stand of individuality and success as an individual, not necessarily as a communal connection. And I think breaking down those has been critical. And even in the church, I see that we need to be able to sit with multi-generational interactions and be able to learn from each other, because I think we're negating, I mean, when we look at the body of Christ, every piece is indispensable. And I think sometimes we as a church, whether it's you're considering people of different ages or different abilities or whatever, to not identify of all of that is integral into making a healthy body.
Yeah. We could talk about generation ageism for ages, because there's a lot to talk about. But I'm stoked and thankful for our guests today with Trudi and Kayla and Brad, discussing generational issues, generational leadership, because the church, in order to be the church, should be out front leading the way, showing the beautiful makeup of what it looks like when we are diverse, when we're not homogenous, when we are like-minded for our love for the other, but diverse in mind as to what we look like, what we sound like, how we dress and present ourselves. And I think that from all the wisdom that we've gotten here today, hopefully those of you that are watching via YouTube have really appreciated this, as well as on Facebook. Be sure that you go to right below this video. You hit that subscribe button right there. If you're watching this on Facebook, make sure you go right up to the upper right-hand corner there and like our page. That way you'll be updated with notifications from anything that New Wine is doing, because New Wine takes seriously education, consultation, and transformation. And that's across the generations, across the races, across the genders, this idea of stepping into the life of the other, across religions, like Brad was talking about, the conversations with the Buddhists and with Mormons and Jehovah's Witness, because the idea of dialogue is not just something that we do pragmatically, it's something that we do because it's who we are. It's relational, to step into the life of each other. And so we're thankful for that. You can also catch this if you're going to be working out and you need something to listen to, anchor.fm/new wine, new wineskins, our podcast as well. And then if you need any information, you want to get connected to New Wine, you want to hook up with Trudi and talk about the disability and special needs, because that's what she's doing her doctorate work on. You want to hook up and talk to Kayla about university things going on, or Brad about actual aspects of the academy and the church, please go on over to new-wineskins.org. There's the ability to connect with us, to get the newsletter, to see what's going on, so that you can become a part of the New Wine family. Like each person here has said, community for New Wine is family, just like it should be for the church. And so until the next time, next Thursday, we are going to be live, because we are going to overcome the technical difficulties of our internet. They cannot get us down. So on behalf of Brad and Kayla and Trudi, I'm Matt Farlow. Thank you so very much for joining us today. We'll see you again on the flip side.